Chapter 10, Presentation Introductions. The most important thing to remember about introductions is your intended purpose. This can sometimes be independent of the overall objective of the presentation, but be sure that your opening is not arbitrary. Before we discuss some of the different techniques, the what, you'll need to understand your reason, the why, for using them, the strategic part. No one really tells you these aspects, so I hope to give you a better understanding. If you're going to start your presentation by asking a question, don't do it for trivial reasons. Even if you correctly execute the technique, it may not be effective. So, think about why you're asking the question and what you are looking to accomplish. Ask a question because you want the audience's buy-in and because you think this is the most efficient way to engage them. On another strategic note, make sure that no matter which introduction technique you use, it captures the overall tone of your presentation. This is a bit nuanced and may take practice. Think of the opening credits of a movie or TV show. Generally, the opening credits will reflect the flavor of what's to come. Ever watch Larry David's show, Curb Your Enthusiasm? His opening is very short, but the lighthearted theme song sets the mood of the show. This is the same for Alfred Hitchcock movies, etc. You get the point. Another thing I'll quickly share, and granted, this is probably reflective of my style, is that I'm not a big fan of shocking the audience. Some people will tell you that's a legitimate opening technique, and maybe so, but I don't see why you would ever need to shock your audience for attention. Shocking the audience to me seems as though you're trying to get attention for the sake of attention. You'll get attention by delivering something good. I prefer openings that captivate my audience. They're more sophisticated for the most part. Also, it can earn you the reputation of being a thoughtful presenter, regardless of the subject matter. Presentation openers. Here are some techniques for openings that are useful and handy. I can't take credit for most of these, but I'll put my own spin on some of them for you. The most common first. Number 1, ask a question. There are several ways to do this effectively. While this is probably the most common way to start a presentation, you should truly understand the purpose of this technique. Seriously, it's not as obvious as it seems. I've seen so many people use this technique and either it wasn't clear why they used it or they only used, quote, half of it. In other words, they ask a question but don't do anything with it. You should anticipate how your audience will respond. If you ask a question, do something with it. For example, if you ask, how many people here know about all of the atrocities happening to children in country X? By asking this question, you probably assume that the majority of the audience doesn't know the answer. If this is the case, you can then, quote, finish by transitioning into your overall theme. This is the proper execution. Whether you're asking a question because you genuinely want feedback, or it's meant to be rhetorical, make it clear. It's fine if you want to make it rhetorical, but make that clear in your tone and inflection. Here's an example of a rhetorical question used to open. How many of us are tired of paying so much for Wi-Fi? This would work well rhetorically because you could be reasonably assured that most, if not all, of the audience agrees. In this case, you don't need any weigh-in. If by asking a question your intention is to get a response, make sure that you get one. Surprisingly, many presenters who want a response may not get one, especially with an unfamiliar audience. In short, make it clear that you want a response through your tone and body language. Alternatively, an easier route is to simply say, quote, by show of hands. This works very well and leaves no ambiguity. Another nuanced part of the ask a question approach is to make sure you have a plan B in your pocket, just in case it doesn't work out. It shouldn't happen too often, but there may be instances where either you didn't research your audience or you did research them but didn't accurately assess them. In either of these cases, you might not get the response you hoped for. This is where having a plan B is crucial. For example, let's say I expected the majority of my audience to be familiar with marketing, but it turns out to be the opposite. Almost no one knows about marketing. By show of hands, how many people here have a basic understanding of marketing principles? You were anticipating many hands, but got only a few. Your plan B in your back pocket can go like this. Even better, because the information I'm going to share with you today is especially essential for non marketing people. The last thing I'd want is for you to get tricked by advertisers. You just got yourself out of a jam, and if you pull it off smoothly, the audience will never know. Again, this shouldn't happen too often, but it can, and you'll need to do a little adjusting on the fly to keep it moving forward. Have a plan B in your back pocket. Don't get tripped up. Number 2, be bold. This can be done several ways, but whichever way you do it, don't be afraid to start off with a bold statement. Obviously, you need to back up whatever you're asserting as you go through the presentation, but this style can really help you exude confidence from the start. You may use this technique with something like this. Today, I'm going to give you 3 reasons why Hamilton, the play, is worth the hype. This is bold for 2 reasons. First, you're articulating that you have 3 reasons as opposed to just reasons, and this specificity exudes a level of confidence because it demonstrates that you've thought this out in advance. Second, using a strong term like, quote, worth the hype, implies that you acknowledge that some people think the play is overrated. You're going to provide 3 reasons why it's worth all the fuss. 3. Say something provocative. If you use this technique, don't confuse it with shocking your audience. That's a separate technique that I won't get into. But you're not trying to shock your audience here. You're trying to make them think. Making a statement that may make your audience members a little uncomfortable or get under their skin may be fine, but it's your responsibility to understand how fine the line is between your intended effect and offending your audience. Remember, you're trying to provoke thought, not insult. You may want to, quote, poke the bear a little, but know how much is too much. For example, if you're doing a presentation in front of a group of rich donors, don't make general statements that are insulting to wealthy people. Number 4, be sincere. In 2014, when Ziauddin Yousafzai, the father of Malala Yousafzai, the youngest Nobel laureate winner, did a TED Talk on his daughter, he started his presentation with, in many patriarchal societies and tribal societies, fathers are usually known by their sons, but I'm one of the few fathers who is known by his daughter, and I'm proud of it. So that's a pretty powerful statement. Plus, it gives you a strong glimpse of what he'll be talking about. Number 5. This is what I'm referring to as the, quote, stereotype approach. Another clever introduction technique is what I call the stereotype approach. With this technique, you're feeding the audience the typical stereotypes that you can reasonably assume they already associate with the topic. For example, when you think of millennials, you probably think of them as lazy, spoiled, entitled, selfish, always on their phones, and that's probably just getting warmed up, right? Then you can begin your presentation by trying to dispel the stereotypes. This works well in some cases since you are really providing your audience with instant credibility. Number 6, instill curiosity. This can be a clever intro technique if used in a situation that really calls for it. Don't confuse this with the ask a question technique. Here, you're probably asking a question, but you'll want to provide either portions of facts or figures, or perhaps purposely leave out some information for the time being. The idea here is to get the audience thinking about your question statement on a deeper level. It doesn't have to be a deep topic, but you want to get them thinking. For example, let's say you started a presentation with, what if, exactly one day before you were born, you can select some of your own attributes, your race, gender, nationality. Remember, you're not born yet, so you have no preconceived notions. You're just selecting off of a menu. Would you do it? Or, if you were able to meet any 3 people in the world, living or dead, who would they be, and why? This technique can really evoke thought and curiosity, even if they haven't had enough time to think of all three names. Number 7, share a story. If you want to use this technique, make the story personal. It doesn't have to be about something tragic or sad. It can be, though, if your topic/slash presentation calls for it. But there are many story types: inspirational, humorous, etc. Just keep in mind it shouldn't be too long. As we've discussed in a previous chapter, the wonderful details may matter to you, but not to everyone else. Again, make it personal, but relevant. Also, do your best to make sure the audience wants to hear it. Number 8, quote someone famous. I'd be careful with this one. Yes, careful. You don't want to come across cliched by using an overused quote. This is just a suggestion, but I'd probably stay away from quotes and references such as Albert Einstein defined insanity by doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Don't get me wrong, it's a fine quote, but since so many people are already familiar with it, it's not all that impactful, in my opinion. Thousands of people around the world probably say that every day, so that's why I think it's not impactful or interesting. Number 9, quote, what I call process of elimination. I once saw a presenter start his intro with 4 photos of people and ask the audience to pick out the CEO of Company X. While I don't remember the whole speech, I remember that this actually worked very well. It had purpose, wasn't too obvious, and wasn't elementary. This method has an interactive element that engages the audience from the start without having them to work too hard. Number 10, humor. Tell a joke or use sarcasm. This is pretty self-explanatory, so you don't need me to offer an example. Just make sure that you're funny, as mentioned in Chapter 7, and that it's appropriate for your particular audience. Sometimes sarcasm can be just as effective as telling a good joke, but if you're going to use sarcasm, I recommend that it be used appropriately. You should have proper inflection, tone, and body language. Facial expressions are also particularly important here. In other words, make sure you exaggerate, otherwise your audience might take you seriously and your entire intro is ruined. I once had a graduate student use sarcasm at my expense to start her presentation. Finally, Al allowed us to pick our own topic for the last presentation of the semester. I'm so happy, and I felt like I was waiting forever. It was funny. I have to admit I laughed a lot, too. Number 11, imagine. This is a very interesting technique. I used it once and it really worked well. This technique requires the right inflection though, so when you start off a presentation with the word imagine, you'll need to do it in a sincere way. It will help to say it a bit slowly, giving great eye contact, and then pausing for a moment before you continue. For example, imagine. Imagine living on a deserted island, all by yourself, and cut off from the rest of the world. If you see your audience's eyes light up, then you did it correctly.